All right, everyone. I just wanted to upload a quick video to explain the answers for homework 3. I know quite a few of you were struggling a little bit, and just to repeat kind of my whole purpose behind the homework discussion boards is I really try not to interfere too much in there at all. I want you all to process through the information, and then I just kind of intercede here and there when necessary, and then upload the answer keys so you can check your answers and get ready for the worksheet. But in this case, I kind of want to walk you through verbally how you can arrive at the answers. So the first question was in regard to the second nominative noun in Romans 1:1, which in this case is servant or doulos in Greek. And this is a nominative of simple apposition. It's renaming the previous nominative noun. Paul. So Paul, a servant, and then you have a genitive of Christ Jesus. And then actually you have another one, called, which is an adjective that's functioning substantively, called an apostle. But that nominative there is simple apposition. It's not functioning as the subject of the sentence. It's not functioning as the predicate nominative because there's no form of the verb to be. So here it's just functioning in simple apposition. Okay, the second thing that I had you look at was Romans 1, 17 and 18, and I asked you about the two genitives in each of those verses. So let me just scroll down there. All right, so the first genitive we have is theou, or God. A few of you put the preceding noun, which is righteousness, but that's actually a nominative, and it's that's the subject of the sentence. For in it, the righteousness of God, though. Yeah, we can talk about that some other time. So here, God is the genitive in question, and I have listed it as a subjective genitive. Now, the reason for that, and some of you put possessive, in other words, this is God's righteousness, right? The righteousness that belongs to God. As you went back in the last part of the homework and looked at the word, what I was hoping you would discover is that this isn't just a quality that you have. It doesn't just, it's not something you can own, in other words. From a biblical perspective, this is something that God does. This is an activity. This is something endemic to his character, and as such, it is something God is displaying, hence a subjective genitive. For in it, the righteousness displayed by God is being revealed. So that's why that is what I take as a subjective genitive. And then likewise, the parallel phrase in verse 18, for the wrath of God. In other words, the wrath displayed by God. Now that one is a little bit more obvious that it's a verbal, it has a verbal quality, an active quality, wrath. We often in English describe wrath as something being done, right? I'm showing you my wrath. But in English, we don't often talk of righteousness that way. However, in Greek, these two things are being compared one to another, right? In this, the righteousness displayed by God is being revealed, but in this, the wrath of God, in other words, the wrath displayed by God is being revealed. When you put them next to each other, it actually makes sense that they're both functioning subjectively. These are subjective genitives. Okay, so then in 118, I also asked you about the dative noun. So the dative noun that we are looking at is unrighteousness, or adikia. In this case, there are two answers. It's really functioning as a dative of means, but it is technically the object of the preposition en, which is right before it, which I'm highlighting now. And you can see down at the bottom, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next week. It's a preposition plus a dative, and it means in, with, by, or to. This preposition can also have an object, namely in this case unrighteousness, and it functions as a means. So in other words, this is the means by which they suppress the truth, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Okay, so this is a dative of means, but if you put a object of a preposition, that's also correct. Okay. The next genitive I had you look at was in verse 26. So let's scroll down there. All right. So the first genitive we have here is atimias, or dishonorable. This is a descriptive genitive, and actually your English translations gives you a fairly clear idea that that is the case, because they actually translate it into an adjective in the English text. If you look at it here, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Actually, the text just says passions of dishonor, dishonor being a noun. And the English translators have turned it into an adjective, dishonorable, and accompanied it with passions, because really it's functioning adjectively here to describe the kinds of passions that God gave them up to. So in this case, you are just looking at a descriptive genitive. All right, and then the last one I had you look at was back up in Romans 1, verse 5. So let's jump back up there. So there are two accusatives, one right after the other. Here, grace and apostleship. And here they're just both functioning as direct objects, through whom we received grace and apostleship. So they're, in this case, they're receiving the action of the verb, namely, they're being received, right? So they're both functioning as the direct objects. There's no double accusative going on there. Okay. Now let's look at our adjectives. So up in verse 2, the first adjective that we're dealing with is holy. In graphais hagiais, in the Holy Scriptures. This is functioning attributively. Holy is an attributive adjective. In verse 4, the one we're looking at, this is a little bit trickier, is dead. That is the adjective in that verse, and it is functioning substantively, or as a substantive adjective. And you could make that more explicit by saying, just to go from the beginning of verse 4, and was declared to be the Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead ones. That's what's implied there. So it's not modifying any other noun. It is standing alone by itself, so it is substantive. Okay. In verse 5, we have another adjective. In this case, we are looking at all, or pasin. And this is functioning attributively. We just have a funny way of working with the adjective all in English. So among all nations, it's just describing the nations here in this case. But we often put a definite article between all and the noun that it's modifying in English. So it tends to mess with it a little bit. But that is how it's functioning here. All right, the last few adjectives that I had you look at were in verse 19. So let's jump there. The first one being, in English it says, for what can be known. So this adjective here in Greek is actually, it just means knowing or known. And it's not describing anything. In fact, it's functioning like a noun, hence it's substantive. Therefore, the known thing about God is really what it says. The known thing about God is clear, or is known, or plain to them. Okay. So this is the next adjective, the plain here, which is functioning predicatively. Therefore, the known thing of God is, that's your verb, is plain. Plain is not modifying any other noun. It's standing alone by itself, but it is after a form of the verb to be, and it's describing the subject. The known thing is plain. Okay, so that is a predicate. So that one was a little bit tricky. I hope you were able to discern that. All right, and as for the part 3, really just looking up the word in one of your lexicons to get a range of meaning, which you all did well, and then whether or not that affected your translation. Really, if you had already taken that as a subjective genitive in verse 17, then it probably wouldn't have done much, but perhaps if you had originally thought that it was simply a possessive genitive, you would go back and think, oh, well, righteousness is more of an activity. It's something that God displays. It's actually God's displayed covenant faithfulness is really how that word tends to function in the Old Testament, and probably how Paul is understanding it here. And as such, it makes sense for it to be a subjective genitive rather than simply a possessive genitive. So I hope this was helpful. I look forward to taking a look at your worksheets and grading those for you. I'll have them back to you as soon as I can this weekend. I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.